Hello, everyone. My name is Jess Eliot Myhre. I am in the urban planning program, and I'm delighted to be here. My presentation is going to be about electrification and decarbonization and why I believe that these strategies are super important, but they are not going to be our savior. All right. So in sustainability circles, there's a big strategy that many experts are pushing for in an effort to reduce our carbon footprint. It's a two-part strategy involving electrification and then decarbonization of the grid. So in other words, we electrify things that now use natural gas or other fossil fuels, and then we ensure that the electricity that is now used to perform those tasks is generated by renewable energy. So the main sectors in which to do this that make the most sense are here. This is a diagram of the US's greenhouse gas emissions by sector. So this is the transportation sector. And then this here is our buildings. The direct emissions is mostly heating space and water. Electric vehicles are a perfect example of electrification in that strategy, transitioning the power source from gasoline and diesel to electricity. Sorry, give me a moment. Okay. And then electric heat pumps in homes and small businesses is also a really good example of this. Sorry, this is confusing. All right. I'm sorry, how do I go back? I must have missed a slide. Okay, thank you. So these here are the research questions that are guiding me. If we electrify our vehicle fleet, what's going to be the additional electricity demand on the grid? If we electrify space heating and water heating in our buildings, what is that additional demand on the grid? And then what type of energy will we use to meet that additional demand? And how much carbon equivalent would be emitted in the process of this large scale electrification and decarbonization? So let's begin with a little context. This here is the breakdown of how power has been generated in the United States since 1950, or over the last 70 years. So electric vehicles and other electrical appliances, they're only as green as the electricity that provides power to them. So presently, we are at about 13% renewable energy. You see that's the green line here. In 2020, it made up about 13% of all of our electricity generation. And I know there are visions and plans to expand the use of renewables, but this is where we're at now. So of the renewable energy generation, wind is a little under 30% and solar is just over 12%. And so what happens if we electrify? To calculate the amount of additional energy needed to electrify space heating and water heating in our buildings, this is what I did. Here on the left is a chart of US natural gas consumption by sector. Most residential and commercial buildings in the United States use natural gas to do the space and water heating. And so we're concerned here with the commercial and residential sectors, and it accounts for about 26% of our country's natural gas consumption. So 26% of that total, 30.28 trillion cubic feet. I love that that's how we measure natural gas, by the way. So many different, metrics. So about 20% of that is just under 8 trillion cubic feet. So here we do the math. We use 7.87 trillion cubic feet of gas to heat our buildings. And we ask how much electricity would it require to perform that same function. So we do a couple of conversions there, turning that energy into BTUs and then kilowatt hours. And then because heat pumps are so much more efficient than burning gas, especially those used for space heating, we're able to get more bang for our buck. We have a weighted coefficient of performance of 1.88 for our electric heat pumps. And so it ends up coming out to about 1,273 billion kilowatt hours of electricity that would be needed to heat our buildings in this country. And so we're going to come back to that number. I know that without context, it's basically meaningless. Oops. Okay, but, oh no. Sorry, give me just one moment. Okay. But first, let's move to this other piece, electrifying the transportation sector. Here, with this math, I'm focusing just on electric vehicles alone, not the whole sector, not trains, not planes, not boats, just vehicles on the road. And so I calculated how much additional electricity would be demanded of our grid were we to electrify our present vehicle fleet in the United States. Right, math time. In 2021, in the United States, 45.6 billion gallons of diesel were sold and 141 billion gallons of gas. So that's how much fuel it took to power our vehicle fleet last year, or the year before last year. Here I converted that energy into kilowatt hours. We take the average efficiency of a diesel engine and a gas-powered engine respectively, and we come up with a total of 1,814 billion kilowatt hours necessary to power the US vehicle fleet in 2021. So if that's how much energy it required, how can we make that happen using electricity? So we first look at the efficiency of our EV engines, which is way better. It's about 80%. And so that ends up being about 2,267 billion kilowatt hours of delivered electric energy in order to move our vehicles. And so accounting for the transmission and distribution losses along our grid, which is about 7%, that gives us 93% efficiency. And so we get a total number of just under 2,500 billion kilowatt hours produced in order to run our present vehicle fleet here in the United States for 1 year. Okay, we're coming back to that diagram that shows us how much electricity is generated in the US. And so we saw earlier that in order to electrify our space and water heating functions in buildings, that requires 1,273 billion kilowatt hours of electricity, ends up being, about a quarter of our present demand. And then to electrify our present vehicle fleet, that ends up requiring just under 2,500 billion kilowatt hours of electricity. And so, over half, about 2/3 of our present entire demand of our entire grid right now. So you add that up and it basically is doubling the electricity demand that we presently have for everything that we run off of electricity in this country. And so what this means in terms of the electrification decarbonization conversation is that if we're going to electrify, we're not just needing to green one grid, we need to green two grids. And so before we move too far away from electric vehicles, I want to touch on this as quickly as I can. There's a lot of numbers up there. But I want to just give a small sense of the carbon impact of building all of those batteries. So electrification, again, while it's a wonderful strategy, it also does come with its own very high carbon impact. And so batteries in particular, they're very energy and carbon intensive to make. This chart shows a breakdown of the US vehicle fleet and what battery capacity would be required to electrify it. You can skim it. The number that's important is that one in orange at the bottom. Basically, if we add up the total kilowatt hour capacity needed to replace our existing 275 million vehicles on the road, we would need 3.77 billion kilowatt hours worth of battery. And so if you translate that into carbon emissions, you end up getting 3.77 gigatons of carbon equivalent emitted into the air to make all of those batteries for those vehicles. And so put that number into perspective. In 2020, the United States emitted a total of 4.5 gigatons of CO2 in all sectors. So when we think of electric vehicles being super green, they're so much better than gas-powered and diesel-powered cars, for sure. We can't think that they come with no carbon price tag, is kind of the point of this slide. And just to kind of like put a little bit of icing on that cake, this is just the batteries. This is not the rest of the cars, and it's not the rest of the transportation sector. It's just the batteries for the cars in our present vehicle fleet if we continue to drive this many cars and vehicles. Such a happy presentation. All right, so there's also issues with a huge ramping up of renewable energy for our grid. We think of wind and solar as green and using no fossil fuels, but the production of this technology is a carbon intensive process. Most of the PV panels and solar infrastructure we use in the US is produced by China, and they're made in plants that are run using coal. And so solar and wind are also intermittent sources. When the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, power is not being generated. The grid, when people use electricity, that generation needs to meet it instantaneously. So intermittent sources just come with different challenges. You need to have some kind of storage capacity. Batteries, pumped hydrological storage, these are all possibilities, but we can't produce enough batteries for grid storage. That would be even more CO2 impact than that whole vehicle fleet. And so to be very clear, I am an advocate for solar and wind energy, and I believe that increasing the share of these technologies in our production electricity is definitely the right thing to do. But for practical reasons and also resiliency reasons, they can't be our only source of power. And so this presentation is not meant to be doom and gloom or to send anyone into an existential environmental crisis. It's meant to point towards other solutions. And so this research is meant to help us to visualize why and like really integrate why this strategy of electrifying everything and then making the grid run on renewables, it's just not going to get us to our climate goals. We need to do it, but we need to do so much more. We will produce a huge, like an insane amount of carbon in the process of trying to green our grid if we keep electricity demands as high as they are. And so this strategy of electrification and decarbonization, it needs to be coupled with systematic and radical strategies for reducing our energy use. Otherwise, putting this much demand on the grid, it's just going to delay our ability to like retire our coal and our gas plants. So we need instead, or not instead, but in addition, we need to build systems and spaces that allow us reasonably to use less energy. And so this research points us towards other strategies that are probably less sexy. They're definitely less technologically driven to help us reach meaningful CO2 reduction. So more than anything, creative, large-scale strategies to reduce energy in a holistic way. Things like land use change, transit-oriented development, urban infill, investment in pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, investment in mass transit, things like this. We need to focus more deeply on these conversations if we actually want to achieve our climate goals. Thanks.
Thank you. That's great. Now, this is very exciting. Through the power of technology, we are going to connect with Georgetown, Qatar. We're really delighted to have you, Angelica.
Hello. Good day, everyone. Should I start?
Cool. Okay. Great.
Good day, everyone. My name is Angelica Reyes. I am a second-year undergraduate student from Georgetown University in Qatar, majoring in international economics. And I am here today virtually to talk about the impact of human-induced climate change on typhoon intensity in the Philippines. So the Philippines is surrounded by bodies of water. It has Bashi Channel in the north, Sulu and Celebes Sea in the south, West Philippine Sea in the west, and Pacific Ocean in its east. So its geographic location makes it vulnerable to typhoons. There is an average count of 19 to 20 typhoons in the Philippines per year. And over the past decades, the waters surrounding the country have begun to get even warmer because of climate change. Oceans are absorbing more heat due to greenhouse gases, trapping more energy from the sun. And this heat raises the sea level of the water surrounding the country. So why is this topic relevant? The country has experienced 3 of the strongest typhoons in history as of November 2020. On the left, we see Typhoon Goni, which has devastated the country in late October to November 2020, covering the entire Philippines that you can't even see it from a satellite. The picture on the right shows Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the Philippines in 2013, and it destroyed Tacloban City in the island of Leyte. It remains one of the deadliest typhoons the country has ever endured, with over 7,000 dead or missing. As mentioned, sea levels in the country are rising at 60 centimeters, which is 3 times the global average of 19 centimeters. In addition, a study by Harvard Human Initiative found that Filipinos who are more aware of climate change are more likely to prepare more likely to prepare for effects of climate change and change their lifestyles. And this may explain why in 2020, Typhoon Goni, because of residents of coastal areas may have been more aware of climate change, had less casualties when compared to Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the country in 2013. Having all that said, my research focused on the question, to what extent does human-induced climate change affect the intensity of typhoons in the Philippines? The research was done through a comparative analysis of current studies about El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, ocean eddy, and hydroclimate proxy variability. So, is it ENSO? El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, are above or below sea surface temperature. So a study by Villafuerte and his colleagues in 2020 found that ENSO seasonally influenced the intensity of typhoons in the Philippines. And this is because of its ability to affect global atmospheric circulation. ENSO has phases, namely El Niño, which is characterized by above average sea surface temperatures and central and eastern tropical Pacific areas. La Niña, which is characterized by below average sea surface temperatures in the same region, and the neutral phase, which happens when SSTs are close to average. An 18-year study and extreme weather events by Bagtasa found that ENSO impacts typhoon intensity. And he also found that ENSO events observed in Metro Manila in 1978 and in the 1980s and 2010 had a large-scale forcing, which led to high temperature peak years and influenced typhoon intensity in the country. However, another observational study by Lodanco found that ENSO has no significant impact on the intensity of typhoons in the Philippines. The number of typhoons are actually greater in neutral phases than in El Niño and La Niña phases. So there's not enough evidence to deduce that ENSO is significantly impacting the intensity of typhoons in the country. And the intensity is more associated with large-scale environmental forcing, such as sea surface temperature rise. The last ENSO in the Philippines lasted for 18 months, and it ended in July 2016. And both typhoons that I mentioned before, Typhoon Goni and Vamco, occurred in 2020, which is a non-ENSO period. In this picture, we can see Typhoon Vamco, or with a local name Ulysses, over the area of the Philippines, which almost covered almost the entire country. So is it ocean eddy that affects the intensity of typhoons in the Philippines? So ocean eddy refers to a circular current of water that Wang and his colleagues distinguished to be greatly responsible for the rapid intensification of Typhoon Haiyan in their case study. They found that Typhoon Haiyan would have had less intensity if it encountered only global warming and not a warm core ocean eddy. However, Wei and Huang and their research further examined the influence of ocean eddies on typhoon intensity in the Pacific. And on the contrary, they found that the presence of warm eddy increases low-level convergence into the typhoon's core, which intensified the typhoon, but it also increased the asymmetry of the typhoon, which made it slower. So the presence of the warm core ocean eddy in Typhoon Haiyan actually made it slower and tamed the intensity of the typhoon. Lastly, is it hydroclimate variability that's causing intense typhoons in the Philippines? So hydroclimate variability refers to tendencies of climate to change due to impacts of water and its processes. It is investigated by Bramante in their study about increased typhoon activity by Little Ice Age circulation changes. They found that a pattern of weak typhoons followed by intense and frequent typhoons during the Little Ice Age can repeat on a decadal or centennial scale. They argue that this phenomenon may explain intense typhoons in the Philippines in the recent years. However, it is important to note that this study is not further supported by other researches. So there's inadequate evidence to support the claim that it is hydroclimate variability that's been causing the intense typhoons in the Philippines. So with that, I found that human-induced climate change impacts the intensity of typhoons in the Philippines to a great extent. It has been the main cause of intense typhoons in the past decades. And in this graph, we can see the annual mean temperature and total rainfall of Metro Manila from 1901 to 2018. And it has generally increased from 1901 until 2018 as shown in the figure. In addition, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also published their 6th assessment report. And in their summary for policymakers, they mentioned that there is high confidence that the frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events have increased since 1950. Human-induced climate change is the main driver, and the peak intensity of rainfall and typhoons have shifted upwards, and this cannot be explained by internal variability alone. And our case study about the Philippines validates this IPCC report. This figure shows the precipitation rate change in the Philippines from 1970 to projected countries in 2100. As the global climate continues to warm, we can see that precipitation rates have been increasing since around 2009 and will be increasing until, will continue to increase until 2100. Finally, the IPCC mentions that human activities like aerosol forcing, which can alter cloud formation and can impact the amount of heat in the atmosphere, contribute greatly to observed changes in intensity of typhoons. And this includes our use of air fresheners, cleaning agents, paints, and many more things that we use every day. That said, more importance must be placed on policies that can help the country deal with typhoons. So what can be done? Currently, there is a national agency for disaster risk. This is called the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, and local governments have their own policies for disaster preparedness as well. So the government can improve its adaptation methods through improved warning systems and rescue operations, especially for coastal provincial areas, which are low-lying areas. More evacuation sites can also be constructed. And as I mentioned earlier, a study by Harvard Initiative found that Filipinos who are more aware are more likely to prepare. So educating citizens through social media, television, radio channels, and seminars must also be prioritized. And most importantly, the government must focus on mitigation initiatives. And since seawalls can be costly, especially for countries which do not have a lot of funds like the Philippines, mangrove systems in coastal areas can also be one way to mitigate the impacts of climate change. The roots and trunks of these trees reduce the force of waves, thus help avoid storm surges and flooding. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
I think you missed the first presentation.
Is that the one that ended about greening the grid or not?
Yes, yeah.
But I saw that last slide.
Okay.
And I totally agree.
Okay, great. No, I actually, yeah. Wow.
Sorry,
so,
I'm late, everybody.
yeah. Why don't you offer your reflections and then we'll kind of follow you.
Sure. So, I've been somewhat happy to see us trying to build out more electric vehicle infrastructure, right? I think that's clearly something that's really important right now. At the same time, I've watched that infrastructure go towards creating things like the Ford F-150 Lightning and the Cybertruck, which are like electric vehicles that like use as much energy as a house. And so it's essentially like buying a second house, which I think no one would recommend as being good for the environment. So for that point, I would say that's terrific. Yes. We need behavior change to actually help us mitigate some of the problems of climate change, right? And it's clear that using less energy is one of those things. So, and I'm sorry, I missed the first part of this presentation, but like, what are those behavior changes and where do you feel like there is ways to leverage our current efforts in greening the grid to help us actually achieve those behavior changes? Does that seem like a sensible question? Yeah. Okay.
Very sensible question. That's a very sensible question that I don't have the answer to. That's not what I did my research on. But I actually think that's one of the most important questions for people like us in this room and watching online to be having with each other. And so I'm in the school for urban planning. And so the kinds of solutions that I would head towards are things like land use and like this huge issue of having enormous swaths of our country being just for single family homes only. You know, and I live in PG County, kind of near the West Hyattsville metro station, and I'm watching all this development happen of like garage townhomes right next to the metro station. And so the kinds of development that are like, just like shooting ourselves in the foot, where like people that are living right next to a metro station are incentivized by having like garages built into the bottom of their homes.
Do they have electric vehicle chargers in the garages?
That's a great and very valid question and a very funny question. Yeah. And so one thing that I wanted to be really clear with my presentation is that if I had presented numbers where if we're not trying to electrify and we're not trying to green the grid, the numbers are so much more alarming, you know? And so these are strategies that we do really have to follow, but just like, it's also so important to me to really make it clear to people, like, it's not going to be enough. Like, it's not our savior. And I think a lot of the marketing is around, if you buy these electric vehicles, then you are green, you know? And yeah, it's just it's a big problem.
Oh, on the second one. So I have to change my mindset now. So typhoons, yeah. So I guess sort of maybe the same sort of question, right? So where are you? Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Yeah. Hello, Qatar. So I guess I have a very similar question for you, which is the solutions that you presented, like mangroves and evacuation plans and things like that. Those are institutional level solutions, right? But you also said that people in the Philippines have like started to actually take some action on their own, right? And that's why the second typhoon was not as damaging as the first, right? So is there anything that maybe we can transport or learn from things that individual Filipinos have actually done to help ourselves become more resilient in that way? Or are there things that you would recommend that they do to become even more resilient, right? That aren't necessarily that don't require large-scale social action or political buy-in or any of those other things that institutional solutions need. End of question.
I think that there has been an improvement in how Filipinos listen to officials and experts about climate change and weather events, because before, back in 2013 or before Typhoon Haiyan struck the Philippines, it had, like most typhoons that devastated the country, had a large number of casualties, because people were still, people were still not listening. They were very, forgot the word, but they wanted to stay in their houses and refused to listen to experts when people told them to evacuate. So I think one thing that I have mentioned, that I have observed among Filipinos, is that they have actually started to listen after seeing what impacts extreme weather events can bring. After seeing the effects of Typhoon Haiyan, after seeing the effects of Typhoon Vamco, there's not, like, the impacts of typhoons in the Philippines have not been as large, because they actually have started to listen to weather announcements, or people that like broadcast weather news every day, and National Disaster for Risk Reduction Management reminders and evacuation calls. So I think that's one thing that people can learn from them. They have started to listen more to experts. So yeah.
I'm not sure that's going to fly over on this side of the pond, but it's valid nonetheless. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to offer an additional reflection on both of these presentations. And it's somewhat paradoxical because I see both of these presentations as really having a primary intent of framing the problem, framing the magnitude. And the paradox, of course, is that we want to jump to conversations about solutions. But I think both of these presentations are incredibly valuable in helping us to really kind of take a deep breath and understand what are the challenges that we're actually trying to work towards. The paradox, though, I think comes from, is echoed in Professor Barba's question, and that is, we do want solutions. We do need solutions. And how do we move from this kind of like macro analysis to micro solutions? One of the things in the second presentation that I think is so interesting, especially for research, is that the way in which climate change is expressed is highly regional, right? It's place specific. And so there's so much more research that's necessary in order to kind of frame the problem on a place-based in a place-based manner. And I really see that your research, Angelica, as kind of in that new generation of place-specific knowledge associated with climate change. And Jess, I think your point is very clear. The problem, of course, is now what? What do we do? And finding ways to connect and communicate these larger, macro frameworks and translate them down into kind of local strategies is, of course, the conversation that so many of us are in. So I want to thank both of you again for really excellent presentations. And I do want to extend a very special thank you to Angelica. I believe it's past midnight in Qatar right now on a Friday night. So thank you so much for your excitement in participating in this today.
Thank you so much. It's 11 p.m. That's not really. Thank you.
So let's have a big round of applause for both of you. Let's let's take a 10-minute stretch break. There's refreshments in the back, and also work your way up to one of the posters. We have really excellent additional projects that you can learn about at the posters. So let's take 10 minutes.